welcome to Convocations. Today we have Amanda Hendrix-Komoto, doctor, who is an associate professor at Montana State University, where she researches and teaches about the intersections of race, sexuality, and religion in the American West, and especially how they pertain to the Mormon tradition. In 2022, the University of Nebraska Press published her book, Imperial Zions, which I would highly recommend reading. And today her talk is titled Race, Empire in the American West. And without further ado, Dr. Hendrix-Komoto.
There we go. Ooh, that's echoey. All right. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Eric Freeman for inviting me to speak today. It's okay that he called me Andrea. Andrea, Amy, Amanda, I think are all the same name. I've been called all of them. And my parents used to call me Red, so you're, I guess, also welcome to call me that. So I am a historian of religion, sexuality, and race in the American West, especially as it relates to the Mormon tradition writ large. I write about fundamentalist Mormons, the Community of Christ, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I use the term Mormon to really encompass all of those traditions. Now, if you've been to a lot of academic talks, you know that it has become customary to start with a land acknowledgement. But there's also been a lot of scholars who critique those as largely performative. People often will thank the Native people, but actually don't engage with them at all. And what some scholars have called for people to do instead is to begin by talking about who they are and how it relates to the research that they're doing, and to position themselves within the stories of colonialism and violence and race in the American West. And I'm going to do that a bit today as a way to get you into the talk. And so, who am I? So I grew up in Idaho. Does anybody know where this is? Bonus points if you do. I see a hand, yeah. Very close. I was born in Pocatello. This is the Blackfoot Potato Museum in Blackfoot, Idaho. It is the World Potato Museum, and that is also our city Chamber of Commerce. And so the Potato Museum and the City of Commerce are in the exact same area. And usually I end up talking to people who know very little about Utah and Idaho. I assume you guys know quite a bit more, so I'm going to say a bit, but I won't give you a general history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which I normally have to do. So Blackfoot, Idaho, if you know, is right next to the Fort Hall Indian Reservation, which is the home of the Shoshone-Bannock Nation. And so I grew up maybe about 10-15 minutes away from the Fort Hall Indian Reservation. And what I always found interesting as an adult was how very little I learned about Native American history or Native American people growing up in Blackfoot, even though my great-grandmother's first husband was Shoshone, and therefore most of my great-aunts and uncles were Shoshone citizens. Regardless of that, as a kid, we rarely visited the reservation unless it was to visit a family member or to go to a grocery store which had 50-cent ice cream. And in school, I learned even less. For example, one of the things that I didn't know as a child was the story of the Bear River Massacre. On January 29th, 1863, in Preston, which is, if you're going from Pocatello, closer to the Utah border, a group of California volunteers under the leadership of Patrick Connor ended up killing 250 Shoshone who were banked on or who were encamped on the Bear River in just a matter of hours. What had happened was a different group of Native Americans had been accused of raiding white settlements. The army said that it was coming in to protect the white settlers, and then they ended up attacking this peaceful group on the banks of the Bear River, and the stories that have circulated afterwards are horrifying. There's a story of a 16-year-old boy lying on the ground with his grandmother pretending to be dead in hopes that the soldiers wouldn't find him. There are stories of mothers hiding in the willows and weeds next to the river with their babies, and then their babies start to cry, and they have to make the choice between letting their baby drown in the river and allowing themselves to be discovered and having both themselves and their child die. At the end of the massacre, the ground is still pretty frozen in southeastern Idaho and in Utah at the end of January, and so they can't actually dig any graves or build anything or hold anything customary, and so the Shoshone just end up pushing the dead into the river. I grew up maybe an hour away from this. Nobody ever said anything about it happening. I grew up with Shoshone kids in my school. Nothing was said about it ever. It was only as an adult that I began to hear these stories. But what I later began to realize is even though these stories weren't told, there were sort of hints and whispers of what had happened that people would talk about even though they wouldn't tell the full story of the massacre. So when I was a kid, my stepdad, once told me a story about the Snake River and said that there were what he called water babies that lived in the river, and that they were the ghosts of children who had been drowned by their mothers. And he said that these had been Native women who had drowned their children. Now, it's obviously a story with a lot of racial overtones, but what I realized sort of when I was older and first heard about the Bear River Massacre is that that story of ghosts haunting the river, and the second part of the story is that they would drown people who came too near, has eerie remnants or resonances with the Bear River Massacre story. And I think one of the things that ends up happening is people end up telling these stories and remembering these stories, even if they don't want to talk about them. And you get little slips of stories that then end up getting transformed into ghost stories, folk tales. There's also some suggestion in Shoshone religious traditions and folk traditions and cultural traditions. There are stories about Small Creek. Some of that is being overlaid onto the story that my stepfather was telling. But as I was thinking about these stories and the fact that I hadn't heard about the Bear River Massacre, I became increasingly interested in how particular families make sense of the place that they've grown up in, its histories, and their own family stories within these larger histories of U.S. empire and colonialism. And because I'm from southeastern Idaho, for me, thinking about the settlement of the West, the violence that entailed, also means thinking about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or more broadly, the Mormon tradition. Because as all of you likely know, Pocatello, Blackfoot, Idaho Falls are all very heavily Mormon. And so those two histories are going to intersect. Initially, when I was doing this research, I thought of it simply as an academic project. But I began to think about my own family story within that, as well as the stories of other people. And so today I want to look at how families think about these histories by looking at three particular families. The first is my own family. The second is the family of Joseph Smith, and particularly that second generation. And the third is John T. Garr, who's a man from the Cache Valley. So let's start with my own family history then. So this is a woman named Ada Clements. She was born in upstate New York, and this is my something great-grandmother. I actually haven't counted the generations. She was born in upstate New York in 1801 and married a man named Albert Clements on January 28, 1820. When she was in her 20s, a local man named Joseph Smith claimed to have found golden plates near Palmyra, New York. Stories of his discoveries began to circulate in upstate New York. In 1830, he founded the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Ada first heard about Joseph Smith and the church in 1832 when her husband Albert purchased a copy of the Book of Mormon when he was on a business trip. The two then became convinced that God had inspired Joseph Smith in his translation of this new scripture, and then they joined the Latter-day Saints. And then they ended up following the Latter-day Saints as they moved from upstate New York to Kirtland. They then go to Illinois, to Salt Lake, and then for some reason they end up settling in Idaho. And so their history ends up spanning the sort of entire span of that early 19th century Mormon history. One of the things, you may have heard of Ada Clements, even if you don't know that you've heard of her, if you've heard the story about Joseph Smith, and I should say most historians believe this didn't happen. I believe my ancestor and have a burning in my bosom with no academic evidence that it did happen. Ada Clements writes in her diary, and there's an affidavit saying that she saw Emma Smith walk in on Joseph and Eliza R. Snow kissing, and then pushes Eliza R. Snow down the stairs. It's a salacious story. Most people think it didn't happen. There is some evidence that something occurred between Emma Smith and Eliza R. Snow, and Ada is one of the few sources for that particular story. Now, Ada ends up having a daughter named Eliza Clements. Eliza is born in, and I can never pronounce this correctly, even though I grew up in Idaho, Nauvoo, and she ends up getting married in 1853, and her husband also ends up marrying her younger sister. She experiences quite a lot of domestic abuse in that relationship, and then ends up leaving her husband and moving to Idaho. And the stories of Eliza and Ada were really some of the first things that ended up shaping the way that I think about polygamy and its relationship to sort of the settlement of the West. Eliza's story is actually pretty tragic. She, after she leaves her husband after years of domestic abuse, ends up getting remarried. And then the Salt Lake Tribune reports that she, quote, brooded over her troubles until her mind became unbalanced and she was placed in an insane asylum at Blackfoot, where she was kept until a cure was effected, after which she was married again, end quote. There's some evidence that what ended up happening is she had a miscarriage after her husband had put her away, and that it was that miscarriage that actually ended up breaking her or causing her to act in some way that she was sent to an insane asylum. There's also family stories that we'll get to in a minute, which is why I include Eliza and Ada in this, about the relationship of this family with Native Americans. So if you were paying attention in that newspaper article, it talks about Eliza leaving the insane asylum. And one of the ways that we know that happened is because we have this particular letter. This is from the Blackfoot Insane Asylum. It's right across from Mountain View Middle School. If you are or know anybody from Blackfoot, Mountain View Middle School is actually where I went to middle school. But it talks about Eliza Kendall. Her husband's name was Kendall, which is why it says Eliza Kendall instead of Clements, petitioning to get out of the asylum. It says, "We have an inmate here by the name of Eliza Kendall, who is one of the planners of Utah. She is sane and very anxious to be present at the celebration. I told her I would write you, and if you would furnish transportation for her, she may go. Friends in Ogden will care for her." And the celebration that they're talking about is the 1897 celebration of the arrival of the Saints into Utah. They brought together all of the people who had arrived in the first companies and then took a photo of them. And we know that she was released because she appears here in this particular photo. And so that is Eliza after she was released from the insane asylum. She then makes a couple of life decisions I would have advised her against. Her husband, Levi, comes after the death of her sister and asks, presumably, if they could get remarried because she remarries him. And then she ends up living with Levi Kendall until they both pass away. Now, one of the reasons why I tell the story of Eliza Kendall and Ada Clements is one of the things that we often don't talk about when we think about the settlement of the West is what that experience was like for women. Most women in the outlying settlements found themselves very isolated. They ended up doing a lot of the work by themselves, and they had very little recourse when it came to being able to escape domestic abuse and find other places to live. There are stories in Provo, for example, the man who was in charge of the Provo Insane Asylum ended up founding that building because he was so horrified when he went around to rural families at the way that they were treating their insane, and we should put that in quotation marks, family members. He found one polygamous wife who had been very angry when her husband brought home a second wife, and had attacked the husband and the wife that he had brought home. And so they placed her in the attic and then walled it off, and then brought her food, which they put through a window. And this so horrified the man that he ended up starting a campaign to start an insane asylum in Provo. But you get these stories all over the place of how difficult it was for both monogamous and polygamous women to be involved in the settlement of the West. And then the other thing that you get is stories of the ways in which these people then become involved with local Native American communities. So one story that I was pretty sure my family had made up was that one of Eliza's family members, Marianne Barzee, had nursed a Native child who had been brought to her after the mother had died. The story they claim, and they use racist language that I'm going to avoid, is that a Native American man had shown up, presented the baby to her, and then asked her to nurse it. The family history then says that she raised it as her own until it died, or she died about, I think the baby was 2 or 3 at the time. And this seemed like a story that white families tell all the time that had very little basis in reality. Then I looked at the Pioneer Cemetery in Springville, and there's actually a grave for the child that they said that she nursed. And you get a lot of these stories within family histories about their interactions with local Native Americans and what those looked like. Some of them involve fear, some of them involve caring for people, but families continue to tell these stories about their interactions with Native Americans, even though they're not necessarily included in the stories that we tell within our school system. The other thing that I realized is how close to the present these stories are. This is Ada Alzina Barzee. She is Mary Ann Barzee's daughter, or it might be granddaughter. This is my grandmother's grandmother. She grew up in a polygamous family. Does anyone want to take a year, or guess what year she died? So she grew up in polygamy. What year do you think she may have died? Later. It's really a guess. There's no wrong answer. Well, there's a wrong answer, but no one expects you to have the right one. Later. Okay, that is too, so now we got to go the other direction. It was 1993. And so the children of people, and this is not a man of, like, she is not getting, her parents got married before 1890 when polygamy ended. So lives are long, that's part of it, right? But she dies in 1993 and was the last member of my family who had actually experienced polygamy firsthand. I was born in 83. I never met her. My grandmother did not get along with her family, but I was 10 when she passed away. And so that's how close these stories end up being. And here is, my grandma's the baby there. So here she is with that same woman who you just saw in that picture. So my own personal family, oh, I could have done that one earlier. The way that they've dealt sort of with colonization and the violence is largely not to speak about it. One story that's often told about the settlement in the West is one that's told from the perspective of white settlers, that foregrounds their stories and the way that they think about things. In my own classes when I teach, one of the things that I often show to my students is a short TED Talk by a Nigerian feminist talking about the dangers of telling a single story. And I think one of the things that is the danger of telling a single story is that there's all of these silences that you can't really get at unless you have different points of view. And it's not necessarily that that single story is wrong, it's not the whole picture. The experiences of Marianne Barzee, the experiences of Ada Clements, of Eliza Clements Kendall, their stories are interesting, they're painful, they're real, they also need to be told, but they don't tell you everything that's going on. And that's true of my own family as well. My father's side, Latter-day Saints going back to New York. My mother's side is a family of Catholic and Protestants. It's mixed race. My great-grandfather on my mother's side actually immigrated from Mexico after the Mexican Revolution in 1917. My mother does not consider herself Latina, but her father did consider himself Latino. This is a picture of my great-grandfather on the other side. He fled the revolution and then ended up working on the railroad in Pocatello. He's pictured up in that, as well as is, I believe, my grandfather is a small child there. And so even my family's story isn't connected by that single story. My great-grandmother, the one who married, his name is Antonio Alejo Aguilar. Her first husband, as I mentioned earlier, was Shoshone. And these are pictures of the letters that her children, my great-aunts and uncles, wrote to her from Native American boarding school. And so all of our families and all of our communities have these multiplicities of stories that we need to tell. And when I started thinking about what I wanted to write a book about, I wanted to explore the ways that these stories intersected and the way that people were reflecting on those stories. And so one of the stories in the book, I briefly tell my own family story and how it got me there. Let's actually skip forward and talk about John T. Gar and then talk about Ina. So here's a picture of the book. This is a Minerva Teichert painting. If you've been to the Manti Temple, she also painted some of the murals in there. She's from Pocatello, and actually American Falls as well. She ends up moving to Wyoming after her home is flooded when they build the American Falls Dam. But she has a lot of really interesting paintings depicting pioneers, as well as Native American communities and how she saw them. She also grew up right next to the Fort Hall Indian Reservation. And so when she paints, just so you know, when she paints those Book of Mormon paintings that you might see around town or in the Salt Lake Art Museum, or I've never actually been to the Manti Temple, so I'm not sure what she painted in there, but a lot of her depictions of Book of Mormon peoples are probably inspired by the Shoshone in Wyoming and Idaho. And she actually talks about some of her interactions with Native American artists. So the book is really an attempt to understand what happens when we put these stories about Native Americans and white settlers together. And what I was actually really interested in was how the practice of polygamy affected Mormon missionary work, and then how Native Mormons, Native Saints as I call them in the book, responded to a church that sometimes included their stories within the Book of Mormon, sometimes saw them as being outside of that framework, but were imposing a new society on the world in which they lived. And to explore that, I want to tell the story of a man named John T. Gar. Now, John T. Gar, I didn't put a picture up here because the only picture we have of him is not very good. He is a white man, I want to make very clear from the beginning because that's important to the story. And let me get back to my spot. I am less good at telling this from memory. John T. Gar was born in Indiana in 1827. And his parents converted to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1846 when he was 19 years old. The family then traveled to Winter Quarters, Nebraska. He then goes to Salt Lake, works for a while as a cattle rancher, and then is called to settle the Cache Valley in the early 1850s. When he's there, he becomes, the word they use is intimate with a Shoshone woman. You can guess what that means because the two eventually have a child together that they call Johnny. We're not exactly sure how Johnny ends up with his father and what happened to his mother. But at some point, Gar ends up claiming the toddler and then raising him as his own as a bachelor. So John T. Gar is a single father in the 19th century, raising this mixed-race child that he's had in northern Utah. Now, this is happening right around the time of the Bear River Massacre. And this is a picture. Darren Perry, who used to be the tribal chairman of the Northwestern Shoshone, and I went to the Bear River Massacre. And this is a picture of that site. I can't remember, and I should have checked beforehand if this is a picture I took or someone else took. But this is what the Bear River Massacre site looks like today. They're in the process of building a museum about the Bear River Massacre, and the Shoshone are the ones who are designing and putting it together. Now, To be very clear, the local Latter-day Saints are not the ones who actually committed the Bear River Massacre. That was the US Army. But the people who lived in the area celebrated it and cheered the massacre. The minutes of the Logan First Ward were chillingly explicit about their approval, saying, quote, "We, the people of the Cache Valley, looked upon the movement of Colonel Connor as an intervention of the Almighty, as the Indians had been a great annoyance to us for a long time," end quote. And Connor's actually promoted to general after the massacre. So Johnny is going to grow up in this community that has celebrated the death of 250 of his mother's people. And he's going to grow up as a mixed-race child in this community. You can imagine how difficult that is. One of the stories that is published about Johnny in the Logan newspaper is that one day he walked into a store in Logan and somebody said, "Get out, you dog." And when he heard that, he immediately assumed that they were talking about him and became quite angry. The other person claimed, and this is 100 years ago, so we don't really know what happened, that they were actually referring to a dog, but he felt the racism that the people of the Cache Valley had and was very attuned to the ways in which that might refer to him in particular and shape his experience. His cousin said that Johnny would always get very angry when anyone referred to him as an Indian. And I think it's important just to take a moment and try to understand what his life would have been like, even though we don't have anything from him himself telling us what the experience of being in that community in the 19th century, when the massacres just happened, was like. So he grows up and eventually gets married to a white woman named Elizabeth Hulsah. And this is right around the turn of the century in 1900. And they, from what we can tell, have a fairly happy marriage. They end up having, I believe, 4 children. But Johnny ends up dying unexpectedly when his cart overturns in a canyon. And Elizabeth is pregnant with 2 children at the time. Johnny's father, who I'm going to refer to as Gar, tells Elizabeth that she can come live with him and that he will care for her children. And so she moves in with him, and from everything we can tell, Gar was a loving grandfather. People describe him, and we'll talk about how we know this, loving those children, talking about them with great pride, and raising them just as he had raised Johnny. But Gar also ends up passing away. And when he passes away, Elizabeth places or puts a claim on his estate, basically saying, "I am the mother of Gar's grandchildren, and they deserve to inherit." Gar's family, however, also places a claim on his estate, and they reject Elizabeth's claim. And what's interesting is the reasons that they give for it. At the time, Utah had what they called a bastardry law, which said that bastards could not inherit from their fathers unless the father had explicitly claimed that child as their own and had done so in front of everyone. The Gar siblings claim that he never actually thought Johnny was his, and that he had bought him, and this was actually a fairly common practice in Utah at the time, from the Shoshones, and that they had basically been an indentured servant or a adopted child, but was not a legal heir of Gar. Elizabeth asserts that he is Gar's child. The family says that his father must be some guy named Jones, and specifies that this guy lives in Brigham City. And so you basically have a custody case in the courts trying to decide who actually is going to get the estate, the house, the money. The local courts initially decide for Gar's siblings. They say there's no evidence that this child was actually John T. Gar's. What's interesting, though, is the Utah Supreme Court overturns that. And their reasoning was this. On the stand, Gar's cousin admitted that his mother was ashamed to have a Shoshone child and his children bear their family name. And they did not want to have I'll just use the word because everybody I grew up with did, my family does, they didn't want to have an Indian with the last name Gar. And that was his cousin Fielding openly admits that. And other people talked about how the family had reacted to having a mixed race child. And so the Supreme Court says basically that this is John T. Gar's family. These are his grandchildren and his children, and that the family is only doing this because of racism, which honestly is an absolutely shocking decision to come out of Utah or Idaho or any place in the early 20th century. But they recognize sort of what is going on here. And so Elizabeth's family ends up getting the estate and getting the money. The family has talked a little bit about how they regard what has happened. According to her descendants, after this court case is done, Elizabeth doesn't talk about John T. Gar again. She doesn't talk about the fact that her children and grandchildren and descendants are also part Shoshone, and the family just sort of pretends or tries to pass as white. At one point, the children talk about having a Shoshone woman come from a Shoshone Mormon town called Washakie, approach the children and try to talk to them. She doesn't speak English, they don't speak Shoshone, so they're really confused about what happens. They later find out that the woman claims to be their grandmother, and that she had come to visit them, according to the story, to try to create a relationship with these children. After Elizabeth dies, in 1947, the family begins to talk about John T. Gar. And according to a master's thesis that one of Johnny Gar and Elizabeth's descendants wrote, they started to talk about sort of how much they had loved John T. Gar, about the fact that he had allowed them to braid his beard. They talked about the abuse that Johnny had suffered at the hands of his wider family. Apparently he had, I assume, accidentally destroyed, quote, a brand new saddle, and the family had locked him in a granary as punishment. And they began to talk about sort of the woman who had visited, and they give her the name Opal. And they become convinced that she is their relative. And as they're sort of beginning to tell these stories according to Elizabeth's descendants, they decide that they need to try to find out more information so that they can perform, quote, the soul-saving temple work, end quote, that they believe that their family is going to need in the afterlife. And so they begin to reconstruct this family history. And according to Elizabeth's descendant, this begins to shape and reform the way that they tell the history of Mormonism. No longer do they think of Mormonism as beginning in upstate New York. In her master's thesis, she says that they come to see the beginnings of their family and the beginnings of their family's relationship to Mormonism and to the restored gospel as being in the Cache Valley itself. And this is actually really consonant with the way that the Shoshone saints see their conversion to Mormonism. After the Bear River Massacre, most of the northwestern Shoshone convert to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. There are some who are really disappointed with the church and the way that it has been treating them and end up going to Fort Hall under the leadership of Chief Pocatello. For those Shoshone who end up converting to Mormonism, they see Mormonism as coming out of their people's traditions and as being a native faith. For them to be Shoshone is to be Mormon, and they see God as allowing them to reunite the people that they had lost in the Bear River Massacre through temple work. And there's stories among the northwestern Shoshone as receiving visions about where they can find the names for temple work. And so sort of ironically, the settlement of Utah by the Latter-day Saints had absolutely destroyed the Shoshone and destroyed their families through death, through destruction. But they then are able to take that same faith and use it to, and this is true whether or not you sort of believe in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they see themselves as reuniting their families through temple work, and it becomes a very meaningful experience for them. And so for them, Mormonism is still a story of dispossession, but it's not a story of dispossession that focuses on the people who are participating in Zion's camp or who are moving west to the Salt Lake Valley after Joseph Smith's martyrdom. For them, the dispossession is about their family refusing to recognize who they are and to see them as being equals. And this becomes the moment in which their family story begins. So that's sort of the focus of the book. How do we understand these narratives of dispossessions and the way that people tell them? I have since begun a new project, which I'll tell you a bit about. I promise you it's related, and we'll talk a little bit now about the family of Joseph Smith. So I still remain fascinated with families and polygamy and colonialism and the ways that people tell their families. And one of the things that has interested me is the Smith cousins. We'll go ahead and show you this painting just because I think it's cool. The way that I ended up giving the talk is a little bit different than how I had planned, so it didn't fit, but I love this painting and the way that it depicts the first vision. But the Smith family always saw this first vision as being part of their larger family history. Lucy Mack Smith, who is Joseph Smith's mother, sees her entire family as being a chosen family that is having spiritual experiences. And then after Joseph Smith's death, the question for the Latter-day Saints and for the Smith family in particular is how they are going to make sense of and understand the loss of their family members, but also the faith that their fathers had created. One of the people who has always fascinated me is a woman named Ina Coolbrith. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about her story to give you a sense of how she's making sense of this family history. Ina Coolbrith is originally named Josephine Donna Coolbrith by her family. They call her Ina for short. She is Don Carlos's daughter. Don Carlos is the brother of Joseph Smith, and then she is the daughter of Agnes Coolbrith, who is pictured here. Ina is born in 1841. Her father ends up dying of consumption shortly after her birth, and so she grows up fatherless. Her mother did not have a son, and in the Old Testament there is a verse that talks about if your brother dies, you should marry his wife to produce him an heir that he can then claim in the afterlife. And so Agnes ends up being sealed to Joseph Smith in a Levirate marriage. It's the only Levirate marriage that Joseph Smith participates in, and that's the name for that type of marriage. And so Ina is Don Carlos's daughter, but she is even more closely tied to Joseph Smith as a niece would normally be through her mother's sealing to Joseph Smith. After Joseph Smith dies, Agnes briefly is sealed to George Albert Smith, who is Joseph Smith's cousin. She ultimately decides, however, that she needs to move to St. Louis, and she ends up marrying a man named William Pickett. William Pickett ends up participating in the California Gold Rush, and they move the entire family to California. We'll move back to Ina's picture. Ina believes, like her grandmother Lucy, that her family has been chosen. And she, at a very young age, is a talented poet. In California, she is published as a poetess when she is only 15 or 16 years old by the Los Angeles Star. She sees her poetry as part of the prophetic blood that is flowing through her veins as a member of the Smith family. She, however, is somewhat distant from the rest of the saints because she is living in California. And although she sees herself as a Latter-day Saint, she absolutely rejects Brigham Young's authority and does not believe that he is a rightful inheritor of her uncle's prophetic mantle. She also rejects the practice of polygamy. And when her cousin Joseph F. Smith, who later becomes a prophet of the church, writes to her and tries to convince her that the Book of Mormon and scriptures in general approve of polygamy, she writes him back and tells him that she's never going to join a harem and that he should reread his Book of Mormon and see what it actually says. And so she's quite feisty. And even at the age of 14, 15, is able to quote scripture and verse from the Book of Mormon to make her points. She ends up as a fairly young woman getting married. It's an abusive relationship. At one point, he accuses her of adultery and then pulls a gun on her. She also ends up losing a child, and there's not a lot of details why, but the family says that they blame her husband, and so she gets divorced. Around the same time as her divorce, the Mountain Meadows Massacre happens, and she is so disgusted with what has happened with the Mountain Meadows Massacre, with the way that she has been treated as a Latter-day Saint, that she ends up leaving the church at that moment. And she decides that she needs to remake herself. There's quite a lot of violence in California at this time towards Latter-day Saints, because the people in California blame Latter-day Saints for the Mountain Meadows Massacre and see themselves as avenging the death of the people who were killed at Mountain Meadows. And so Ina, after the Mountain Meadows Massacre, because of her own disgust, because of her fears, ends up going not by Josephine Smith, but going by Ina Coolbrith, which is her mother's maiden name, and then the pet name that her family had called her. She moves to San Francisco, and then she becomes an important figure within San Francisco's literary elite. There's rumors, unproven, that she may have had a love affair with Mark Twain. She mentored Jack London. If you've heard of the dancer Isadora Duncan, Ina Coolbrith was her father's friend and considered herself to be Isadora Duncan's mentor. She helps launch the careers of several important writers within California, not just Jack London, but people who were important at the time who you may or may not have heard of. She's close friends with the environmentalist John Muir. She's sort of like a Forrest Gump of early California history. She successfully ends up hiding her identity. Most people don't know that she's a Latter-day Saint until after her death, when it's published in a newspaper in 1928. But she still sees herself, even though she's abandoned sort of the Mormon tradition, as using a prophetic power and her ability to write poetry to call people's attention to the environment, to the ways in which God can be found in nature. She writes a poem about growing up in Nauvoo, and she talks about her family going out into the forest to breathe faith while they gathered around an oak tree. And so even though she abandons the institutional church, there's ways in which she is still influenced by her family and is trying to make sense of that family story. She also ends up raising other people's children. Her sister ends up dying of tuberculosis, just like their father did. Ina actually has tuberculosis at the same time, but survives. She takes her sister Aggie's children into her home, and then she also ends up raising a mixed race native child that another California poet just left on her doorstep. So she takes that child in, it's a girl, and raises her to adulthood. And she does this all as a single woman because she refuses to marry after her disastrous first marriage and says that she distrusts marriage and sort of realizes that it had offered her no protection. To make ends meet, she ends up working in the Oakland Public Library up to 14 hours a day, 70-hour weeks, trying to support these children. In the late 19th century, she becomes California's first poet laureate out of recognition for her connection to the past, the strength of her poetry, and the role that she has played. These are her two cousins. What's interesting here, and what I'm interested in exploring, is both of her cousins are recognized as prophets. They look a lot alike as young men. At the top is Joseph Smith III. He is the founding prophet of the Community of Christ, or the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He, very much a follower of Brigham Young, very much a defender of polygamy, writes back and forth to Ina throughout their lives. He never stops trying to convert her and bring her back into the church. Went into Joseph Smith. Joseph S. Smith. Joseph Smith III does not believe in polygamy, no polygamous wives, hates polygamy actually, but he writes back and forth to her as a cousin the man at the bottom, Joseph F. Smith, becomes a prophet within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He's the one with several wives, and he is the man who helps superintend the transition from polygamy to monogamy, and never gives up trying to convince Ina that she needs to move to Salt Lake City. And she tells him back and forth that she's having none of it. What I find absolutely fascinating about Ina is that she maintains this Mormon identity even though she never identifies after the 1850s as a Latter-day Saint. And I remain fascinated with how sort of these children are trying to make sense of their family legacy. Ina dies in 1928. What's interesting about her death, has hundreds of people at her funeral. She's buried in an unmarked grave, as was her mother, and several other members of the Smith family. And one of the things that I want to find out is whether that's because she's afraid if people find out who she is, that they will come and desecrate her grave. I don't have any answers to that at this particular moment. I'm still investigating how she defined herself in relationship to her family, but I'm really excited to find out sort of how these children of the Smiths are making sense of that tradition and experiencing it. But I'd also love to hear any of your own stories or answer any questions that you have. So questions?
Yeah, let's see, if the TAs want to come down with microphones. It looks like it's close to 1:20. If you do have a class, you can quietly walk up, but we will leave 5-10 minutes for questions otherwise. So take a minute. If you have a class, you can go, but if not, hang around for a couple minutes.
It's all right.
Oh, wait, is this on? Oh, it is. Okay. So you said there were a lot of half-told stories and then a lot of also false truths out there.
Yeah.
How do you specifically come to know if a resource is accurate and kind of what's the process looking like that? And
So the answer is you can never know for sure, but you have to look at other sources and see what you can corroborate and not corroborate. And so if there's a story that I'm not sure if it's true or not, I'll look at censuses, I'll look at other people's diaries and just try to see what other people are saying about the same thing. But there are definitely stories that we'll never know if they were true or not. One problem with looking at census data, for example, is it's only done every 10 years. And so if you had a 7-year-old who never had a birth certificate and died before the census, they may never show up in it. And so trying to corroborate that can be really difficult. And so part of it is just trying to corroborate what you can, but also being comfortable with saying I don't know, this could be, it could not be. But the fact that it's being told in this way tells us X, Y, Z, whatever you want to make the argument for. That's a great question. I saw your hand first, and then we'll come up to yeah.
So what was your initial inspiration to start researching about the Smith family?
I like how so I don't like Joseph F. Smith. I'm sorry if he's anybody's favorite person. I was reading his letters. He is terrible to his wives. He writes them long lists of I heard that you used lye the other day, and I would really appreciate it if you would not. And it's Joseph, do your own cleaning if you're going to complain, right? Or he'll send them lists of words that they've misspelled in their letters. Don't do that if you ever want to be in a nice relationship with anyone. And tells them I hope next time you won't make these same mistakes. He bothers me on a personal, deep level. As you can tell, I get very incensed by, after having read his personal letters, he was an insufferable bore. And I really appreciated how Ina could put him in his place. And so that's actually was the first pull towards her, it was nice to see her just be no, I don't think so. And they would have spats back and forth as well. And I should say, I should feel more compassion for this man. He had a very traumatic life. His first memory is of seeing his father Hiram in his casket. But after reading the way that he treated his wives, he's a complicated figure for me. I initially thought I might write about him, but then decided I couldn't spend that much time in his letters and papers and maintain my sanity. But love Ina, she's fun. She's also really flirty. I say we don't know if she had an affair with Mark Twain. That part is true. I read her letters at the Huntington. She talks about stuff that 19th century women don't usually talk about. She wrote to a male friend about how much she loved when he laid his head in her lap and she could pet his hair. She's not married. He was when she wrote this letter. That's not something you normally find. And I have no idea how she maintained a respectable public persona while being much more open about sexuality and herself and her ideas than people usually were at the time. She also, while you're going to hand it to her, she also loved cats. She collected white Angora cats and had one named Popcorn, which she had photographed by Ansel Adams, which is just sort of crazy, and no one really talks about her. The salmon, yeah.
What first got you into your study of history?
Interesting question. I've always loved, and you can kind of see it in the way I just described Ina, I like stories about the past where things don't quite make sense and seem weird, and then being able to find other information and have what seemed at first to be an odd little tidbit become the thing that unlocks your understanding of that past culture. So to give you an example, one story that I love, even though I don't do French history, is this book called The Great Cat Massacre. And it's a story about how in early modern France, there was this group of, I think, printers' apprentices, and they held a mock trial and hung a cat. And the historian used that weird little story, right? Who would think that you would write an entire book chapter about a cat killing? To talk about the growing anger that a lot of apprentices felt towards their masters because they were being mistreated, and the protections that used to protect their labor were evaporating, and they were finding themselves increasingly exploited. And Robert Darnton, who's the guy who wrote the book, argues that basically the cat became a stand-in for their anger towards these masters, and they were angry partially because the care they thought that this man should be displaying towards them as their apprentices was instead being lavished on this cat. And who would think that you could learn about labor politics and changing French society through the story of a poor cat who is being mistreated and hung and killed. And I love stories like that. That's what makes me really excited about history. All right.
Let's see. So time is about up for us right now. But if you have any extra questions for Dr. Hendrix-Komoto afterwards, feel free to hang out for a couple minutes. But let's give our presenter one last round of applause. Thank you. All right. Thanks.